So as Helen has just said, I'm Becky Brown. I'm one of the primary maths product owners at Twinkl. Lisa is also in the call, so she will be on hand if there's anything that we think that is worth flagging up to you as we go through the session. Just a little bit of background as to why, as to my understanding of mastery and my experience. Before working at Twinkl, I was a primary school teacher for 19 years, nearly made it to 20. And in that time had responsibility for both maths and Key Stage 2, and participated in a mastery research group with my local maths hub. Now, if you haven't already had any involvement with your local maths hubs, they are absolutely fantastic at spreading the word about mastery. And I think I'd probably been teaching about 14 years when I took part in that research group, and it really changed my whole perception and the way I taught maths. Yeah, real game changer. So definitely worth doing if you possibly can do some of that work with the maths hubs. I have delivered quite a lot of CPD in lots of different settings. The difference with this one is that obviously there's a whole host of people here from very different settings, different backgrounds, different situations. So today's session is going to be a more general session around mastery. Some of you may well have schemes of work that you use at school. Some of you might have a completely creative maths curriculum. So I've tried to pick things that can be adapted for whatever your curriculum and setting is. And hopefully by the end of today's session, you will have some things that you will take away and can try in your setting. So we're going to talk a little bit about what mastery actually is. There's quite a lot of misconceptions around teaching for mastery, and obviously despite all that good work that's going on with maths hubs and in other areas, there are lots of new teachers coming in all the time, so trying to keep up and not catch up is quite difficult. We'll talk a little bit about what it looks like in a classroom, and I appreciate that we might have home educators here, but I'm sure there are things that you can adapt for your use. And then we're going to talk about some key elements. So hopefully by the end of the session, you will have something that you will take away with you that you can try, or that you can take back to your classroom or school that will be worth giving a go. So first of all, then, I felt it was probably pertinent to start with national curriculum. The word mastery doesn't necessarily appear in the national curriculum, which is why it can be quite confusing where it suddenly appeared from in curriculum 2014. However, I think when we look at the national curriculum, what we tend to do is just go to those objectives and see what we should be teaching in each year group. But it's the bit before that that really narrows down what mastery is and why we should be doing it. So I'm not going to read through it, but you can see there's mention of fluency, reasoning and problem solving, which underpin mastery really. And then this paragraph, which is the mastery paragraph. Again, it doesn't suddenly say this is maths mastery. There's no big signpost to it, but I have boldened some of that for you. And you can see those things working at the same pace, broadening understanding, challenging through problems, retrieval practice, consolidation, all of those things are real important elements in teaching for mastery. So it does come from national curriculum, despite the fact that if you do a search for mastery, you wouldn't necessarily find it. It definitely is there. So just a quick task then. Mastery when mastery sort of started being talked about by the Department of Education, I don't think people really understood what it was. So it was quite tricky for to have the proper understanding for it. So have a little look. I'm not going to read them for you, but there are 7 statements there. I just want to have a little think about which of those might be myths around mastery. Okay, so I'm not going to ask anybody to say what they think the myths are. You probably have spotted them, but I'm just going to pop on to the next page and show you the answers. So the green ones are all things that we will talk about in a little bit more detail later on in the session, but let's just have a look at those red herrings there. So the first one is that the concept of teaching for mastery was created by the Department for Education. it wasn't created by the Department for Education in 2013. It's been around a long time. Teaching for Mastery is an approach which is used a lot in very high achieving countries in East Asia, like you may have heard about Singaporean maths, Shanghai maths, but also the Cockcroft report in, I think it was 1982, mentions teaching for mastery, and the findings in there very much support this mastery teaching. So it's been around a long time. It took until 2013 for it to appear in the curriculum, but it has been around for a lot longer. Mastery learning is slightly different. It's not quite the same as teaching for mastery, but again, if you've done any sort of education training, you might have heard of Piaget and Bloom. All of that goes alongside mastery learning in some way or another. So it's not one thing that suddenly appeared. It's been around for quite a long time. The other ones there are all things that are key to teaching for mastery. We will talk about them in a little bit more detail, but yes, pupils should predominantly be working through the same content at the same time. There's a real focus on using rich, ambitious vocabulary. That's really important. There is an assumption that all children are capable of succeeding. There's a real growth mindset approach around teaching for mastery. There is a recognition that time is needed. Whether or not your curriculum says you've got 2 weeks to cover addition and subtraction, it's not about that. It's about making sure the understanding is there before you're moving on, because maths is very much a cyclical curriculum. You need those steps to get to the next ones. And then we'll talk about this at the end, but also automaticity is one of those words that came around about the same time as mastery. And it is really important that with teaching for mastery, you are focusing on discussion, you're focusing on vocabulary, and you want children to spend their time thinking through a problem, how to solve it, spotting a pattern, finding different methods. You don't want them to spend all their time recalling, for example, times tables facts. And times tables facts is just one key instant recall fact, but that is one that you might hear about again and again. So we've dispelled a couple of them. Oh, yeah, the other one which we really should mention, because it is probably the biggest myth around mastery, is that teaching for mastery means no differentiation. I think that was the shock thing that kept being said when it first came out, those of you that were in the classroom back in 2014, that it was differentiation was going to go out the window. Well, that isn't in any way, shape or form true. Differentiation might look very different from traditional differentiation. Gone are the days when you might have one table doing 2-digit numbers, one table doing 3-digit numbers, one table doing 4-digit numbers. If you have a really secure understanding of additive relationships, methods of addition, actually the size of the numbers won't make any difference. Your accuracy might go down if you've got more numbers to deal with, but the understanding won't make any difference. So we're trying to come away from that sort of differentiation. But as we'll talk about in a little bit, there are lots of other ways that we can differentiate. So apologies for using an analogy. I know it's quite annoying when people do this, but I wanted to have a way, something that I could hang mastery on, that I could try to make it a bit clearer to understand how it should work. So I tend to use the mastery obstacle course, and I use this with my class. We talked a lot about standing at the beginning of that obstacle course, and the maths concept is full of obstacles. Those obstacles, there might be lots of them, but they start really as a really straightforward obstacle that start really straightforward, and then they change ever so slightly each time, and those steps are so small that before they know it, even children who are quite lacking in confidence in maths or slow to grasp new things can get onto quite complicated concepts towards the end. So the idea is that we're all doing this together. Your job as an educator is for all of your learners to get to the end of that obstacle course, because that will show that they have an understanding of the concept. How they get there might look a little bit different. Some might get there much more quickly than others. Some might need a little bit more support than others. And some it may have to have support in different ways. But the idea is, the expectation is that everybody can get to the end. And I've put there in that middle paragraph that we want each and every child to reach the end of the course, regardless of any preconceived maths ability. And I've put ability in quotation marks because ability is something we try to avoid talking about in mastery. We try not to make any assumptions about, for example, how good somebody is at maths. They might be slower to grasp new concepts. They might grasp new concepts more rapidly. But we try not to put children, to fit children into ability groups, what was traditionally called ability groups. So the goal is that everybody gets there. Now, on paper, that sounds quite straightforward, but when you're in a classroom, that isn't quite as straightforward as it sounds. So I just want you to take 30 seconds, a minute, to have a think about how you can achieve that and what in your setting would be the biggest barrier to you teaching in that way. And feel free to put this in the chat or just keep your ideas to yourself if you want to. What is the biggest barrier to teaching in that way in your classroom? And then I'll move on to the next slide in about a minute or so. Okay, so you've probably got a few things in your head that might be a barrier to you doing that. Quite often, when we're talking about teaching for mastery, people tend to worry about the children who are slower to grasp more concepts, but they also worry about children who are very, very in need of being challenged. And yes, it can be very difficult because you're trying to meet everybody's needs, and with 30 children in your class, or sometimes more, that's really, really difficult. EAL learning can be really difficult. I mean, maths is one of the best things because maths is a language in its own, but sometimes you have to deal with people who have been taught maths in a slightly different way. So yes, it can be difficult, and certainly if you haven't got another pair of hands to help you out, that can be difficult as well. Hopefully the next slide will give you some idea of how you can do it in your classroom. And it's easier said than done, but it can be done. It just needs a little bit of work. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is possible. So this is one possible way we could approach it, and I'll try to address the things that you've put in the chat while I talk through this one. The first thing, so if we're going from left to right, I've got stepping stones there as my obstacle course. The first bit is that everybody needs to get started in the first place. Now, prior knowledge is really important, and you need to know what that prior knowledge is, whether that's through a formal assessment or some informal assessment or from observations. You do need to know where your children are and whether they are able to get started on that obstacle course. Assumptions must not be made about children who are fast graspers. Don't assume that they have all the knowledge they need. Being able to solve a sheet full of calculations is not the same as understanding a concept. So everyone needs to be assessed in some way, no matter. Really important to keep the children together. By withdrawing a group of children to work with another adult, you are not allowing them to hear and see some really rich, confident vocabulary from their classmates. You're not allowing them to see other people make mistakes and learn from them. You're not allowing them to be able to put their ideas forward as well as everybody else. So if it's at all possible to have everyone together, that's really how you should be teaching. Now, in an ideal world, you would have the space, the resources, the adults to do a lovely bit of pre-teaching and maybe a little bit of intervention before you get there. That would be an ideal world. We don't live in an ideal world. I do appreciate that. So it might have to be about being creative. How are you going to make sure the children are ready to tackle that obstacle? It might be that you have got an adult and you can pair them up with a group of children. It could be putting your children in mixed ability groupings. I'll come back to that in a minute. And obviously mixed ability is not right on its own, but you could put them in mixed pairs. but somehow you need to get them able to start there. Now, I also appreciate and have experienced that there may be some children who are so far behind that they need to have an adapted curriculum. Keeping up and not catching up is fine, as long as that's happened all the way along. If you inherit some children in year 5 who have not been able to keep up all that time, then you're going to have a bit of a harder job on your hands, and that's a discussion to be had with your maths lead or your SLT in your setting. So you have to think about how you're going to get there, how you're going to assess, and ultimately you want the children to be able to start the obstacle course together. How you get them, that's a whole other session, maybe a session we can run in the future, but it's a whole other session about how you make sure everyone has the same starting point. The next step is the one that's most important, and it's the one that actually you can probably do with lots of those issues you've talked about in the chat. It's about working as a whole class and interactive. So some people might call this a ping pong approach. So there's a bit of teacher, there's a bit of children, there's a bit of teacher, there's a bit of children. Some people use an I do, we do, you do approach. Same sort of thing. The idea is that there is discussion, there is modeling, you talk about all the different strategies, you have lots of opportunities for children to work in pairs or groups. It's a safe space. It's almost like you're saying, here's our obstacle course, let's have a go at it. And actually, no one's marking anything, but that is when you are doing your most assessment. You are watching. It's really hard as a teacher to just stand back. But actually, that's what is really good here. You have an opportunity to watch, listen. It's not going to happen overnight. Children need to be taught how to do that. They need to be taught how to work collaboratively in a way that benefits everybody. It's not about some children supporting and doing the work for others. It's about being a team. We used to talk about it like a 3-legged race, and you want everybody to go through together. You are a team with your partner, and that might mean that you teach children to question each other, or you have prompt cards on the table, or maybe you have to spend a week teaching them what collaborative working is like. They're not necessarily going to be very good at it to start with. So these are things that will work, but they won't suddenly work. You might have to put a bit of extra in on how they're going to work as mixed pairings, particularly for classrooms that are used to working in very setted ways. It can be a little bit of a culture change, and that is where really you really want your SLT to be on board with that, because a lot of your lesson is not going to necessarily have a lot of evidence. One of the ways we got around this was we had what we called whiteboard books. So where the children would normally have recorded on whiteboards, we did it in like a maths book. Nobody marked it, but it was there. It was evidence that it had happened. You would then go round the pairs, chatting to the children, stretching them with questioning, which we'll come to a bit later, and so on. And that way you do have a kind of evidence, but it's about having the opportunity to get things wrong, for everybody to get things wrong and learn from them. If you are circulating the classroom and you spot that 3 or 4 pairs have had the same misconception, there's your teaching point. If it's just one, maybe you use that as a teaching point to avoid misconceptions. It's hard because you can't really plan for it. You don't know what the children are going to come up with. You don't quite know, but you can prepare what you're going with, your keywords, your key questioning, and so on. So it's tough, but it is doable. And then that is the bulk of the understanding really there. You have to make sure you're challenging, and we'll talk about questioning to do that later. But when they're ready, you obviously want children to also demonstrate that they can solve these problems or apply this concept independently. And that's where they might have an activity sheet or some challenges to do. Not 100 calculations of the same, but maybe 3 or 4 routine questions of the sum, non-routine questions. So it's about now thinking, well, okay, how can I really stretch those children who have grasped that quickly to show me that they really understand it? So that's where you've got your evidence of understanding. And then the very last step is kind of the step that you're going to keep circling back to, really. If you're really teaching for understanding, you would hope that the children would keep that understanding going, but they're going to do another 7 or 8 obstacle courses by half term, and that's quite a lot of learning. So it's about constant retrieval, whether that is through morning meetings, through morning starters, through retrieval quizzes. There are lots of things that you can do to practice that retrieval and keep those skills and strategies going. That's one possible pathway that will not work in every classroom. Only you know how you can adapt that pathway for your setting and for your children. And as I say, I know it's easier said than done. Okay, so I could have filled 3 or 4 slides with elements of teaching for mastery. We don't have time to do all of them today. I tried to pick ones that are adaptable for all settings, and that hopefully you can take away at least one thing today which you think, I can do that. I can do that tomorrow, or I can do that next week. Or I'm going to take that back to my SLT. So I won't read through these, but we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of them. So just have a little look. Maybe there are some that you already do. I'm sure there are lots that you already do, if not all of them. There might be some that maybe you're not sure about. Might be something that you're looking forward to hearing a bit more about as well. First one, conceptual and procedural variation. We'll talk about them separately because they're slightly different things. Conceptual variation is about highlighting the essential features. So you can see there's a key quote there. We need to think about what it is and also what it isn't. It's really important that you do that. And there's some examples on the next slide to show you why. This is one of my favorite bits from Tom Gary's book, and it's referenced there. Imagine we wanted to teach a pupil about the concept of elephants. We would teach them the essential and then vary the non-essential features, because on the face of it, a mouse is an obvious choice for not being an elephant. However, that's not very helpful. What is an elephant? What isn't an elephant? If we were comparing a rhinoceros and an elephant, we want to be really clear on what an elephant is, because they are very, very similar. And you may have seen some of these examples on the next slide before, but these are some of my favorites as to why conceptual variation is important. Thank you. Lisa shared the link to that book by Tom Gary, which is a fantastic read if you want to do a bit more reading on mastery. Conceptual variation is important because the equal sign. Now, you will always have some children who have an understanding that the equal sign means here comes the answer. And they always see, for example, 7 add 3 equals 10. 7 add 3, here comes the answer, 10. And then they'll suddenly come across a calculation with the answer at the start, or they'll come across a balancing where you've got a calculation either side of the equal sign, and they won't be able to tackle it because they don't understand, they haven't seen it. So it's really important that we teach what these things actually are and what they're not, the understanding. I mean, that's a really basic thing, isn't it? The equal sign, but really important that we teach what it means, rather than just saying, oh, okay, here comes the answer now. That's one way of using it, but that isn't what it means. We're talking about equivalency, and it's important that children understand that. And the way you wouldn't necessarily use the term equivalency with very young children, but you would use lots and lots of examples and non-examples so that their understanding was really broad. Another classic is the square in the bottom left-hand corner. Many children given a selection of shapes, including that one, and that same shape on a 45-degree angle, wouldn't identify that one as a square, because they are so used to seeing a square with 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines, which is why it's really important that we teach what a square is and what a square isn't. And shape has recently come up, of course, from Ofsted as needing to be taught a bit more regularly. And it's really important that we're looking at non-examples. If you can spot the non-examples, then you have mastered it much better than just spotting an example. And the last one there is the parallel lines. All too often we teach parallel lines right next to each other, same with perpendicular. Those 2 lines are still parallel, but often children don't recognize that because they think that parallel lines should be right next to each other and that you should be able to draw a little line between them and measure them, which would be quite difficult in that case. So it's about teaching what are parallel lines and what aren't parallel lines, to make sure that children would see that and think, okay, what I'm going to do is continue those lines, and then I'm going to see if they're an equal distance apart. So it's really important to show constantly what it is and what it isn't. And there's a little snip there from one of our resources about showing fractions in lots of different ways, not just one way. And that's even more important with geometry. So that's conceptual variation, making sure you have a really clear understanding around mathematical concepts. Procedural variation is sometimes referred to as intelligent practice. It's about varying calculations or problems in a way which is clever. You're not just picking random numbers and sticking them into calculations. Some calculations are going to be easier than others for lots of different reasons, whether they do or don't require exchange and so on. So it's about thinking, where are we going to start and how are we going to vary this ever so slightly to get to quite difficult calculations. And it's about pattern spotting. Pattern spotting is really, really important in mastery. You'd want children to look at that and spot the patterns. It's not loads and loads of calculations, but you'd want them to be able to spot what was going on there and why, and then apply it to different situations. So conceptual and procedural variation very much underpinning teaching for mastery. We have talked about this quite a lot, but whole class interactive teaching is really important. It's your opportunity to model, and not just model strategies, but model really good vocabulary, model your thought processes, ask children to model their thought processes, and so on. So again, don't make assumptions. Really, this is a really important part of the lesson. It's really important that everyone is hearing and seeing what other people are saying, both right and wrong, and learning from it. It's very much a team. You should go into a mastery classroom and almost feel it. It's like that feeling in your classroom of everybody being in it together. We've talked about that quite a bit, so I'll move on from that one. Rich vocabulary is really important. Don't think that children can't use it, because they can. You know, I know that when words like quotient started appearing and multiplicand, people were a bit shocked. But actually, if children have that vocabulary, they can talk about their maths much more confidently. You might have to help them with it. These are just a few examples of STEM sentences and how you might use those. STEM sentences are vital in helping children to almost frame their answers. So STEM sentences are a brilliant way of ensuring that key and ambitious vocabulary is used. And that's another reason why you don't want some children to be taken out of that initial discussion. You want them to very much hear that rich vocabulary and have a go at it. I mean, they might get it wrong, but that's okay. Your expectation is they have a go at using it, and then you can correct it and use it correctly for them. So it is about that. Okay, so that's vocabulary. Now, oh yeah, so representations, models and images. This isn't just a mastery thing. This has been around quite some time now. But again, this can be a really easy way for you to adapt the learning for different needs in your classroom. We think we need to be careful about using manipulatives for just certain groups of children. They can be used for all groups of children in different ways, and it's about really exploiting those ways to use them. But also, it's almost a stepping stone. It's a really strong way of showing understanding if you can do something in 3 or 4 different ways. If you can show with manipulatives, and show in an abstract way, and show on a number line, and show with Numicon, you've got a much better understanding of a concept. Things aren't just standalone in maths, so being able to show in different ways is a really good way of challenging those children who very quickly say, well, I can do this, I can do this. Can you show me another way? Can you show me another way? Can you explain that? Convince me, and so on. And we'll talk in a minute about those key phrases we could use to make sure we're challenging some of those children who are very quick to say that they got it, but you need to see that without making those assumptions. So representations, models and images should be being used all the time for everyone. And there is a wealth out there that you can use. So it's not necessarily about having, I think somebody earlier on mentioned resources, it's not necessarily about having lots of lovely shiny new maths resources. It's about using what you've got. You know, you can teach an algebra lesson with multi-link. It's about finding those and using them in lots of different ways, using what you have got and just putting in requests for the things you haven't. Okay, questioning is really key to challenging those children who really need it in mastery. I've put some examples of questioning on the side there, but these are the sorts of things that you will use during the lesson to really pull out the understanding. You can't necessarily plan for them, but they are very adaptable to lots of different situations. So what you might do is take those questions and have them in your classroom, or you could have them on your lanyard, or you could have them as prompts. You know, a classroom that are used to working in this way might have those on their tables, because it's not just about you asking the questions, but it might be about empowering children to ask each other questions. You know, it's lovely to hear some children who may be a bit less confident on maths saying to somebody else, well, if you know, how do you know that? Prove it to me. And it's hard. We know, we do that every day. Trying to prove something to somebody who finds something difficult is hard. You have to have a really good understanding. It's not about children helping other children by doing that. It's actually about them evidencing that they have a really good understanding. If you can explain something to somebody else, that's one way of showing it. What's the same and what's different is a really good way. What do you notice? Lots of open-ended questions. Another way and another. I was lucky enough to watch a Singaporean lesson once, and the students very much automatically solved something in 3 or 4 different ways. So it's about trying to instill those things in your children. And again, it's not something that can happen overnight, but it's something which you can definitely work to. What is it? What isn't it? We've talked about. If you know this, what else do you know? Is a brilliant way of really extending some children. Convincing and proving, again, showing good understanding. Identifying an odd one out, but not having a preconceived idea of which the odd one out is. Odd one out works best when there isn't an answer. And actually, if a child can give you a reason for every one of those being the odd one out, that's brilliant. It's not just about doing the answer that's written in the textbook. It's about being able to explain and reason why. And this is why reasoning is woven through it. It's not just something tacked on at the end. When we first went over to mastery teaching in my setting, it was very much, well, I can't see all the reasoning tasks, but actually it became quite clear quite quickly that the reasoning was all happening in that whole class interactive bit, and the children were brilliant reasoners because they had to do it. The expectation was they would do it all the time. Making your own example, not quite like, okay, right now write your own word problem, a little bit more intelligent practice based than that. But can you create one easy example, one hard example? And can you tell me why this one is easy and why this one is hard? For example, it's a bit more than just write your own problem. Could you write one where actually it's going to be a bit trickier? And can you explain why it might be a little bit trickier? Being able to say which question was harder and why is quite important. Filling in what's missing and what comes next. Those are a small example of some questions you might use within a mastery lesson to try to support and challenge at the same time, which is not an easy balancing act, but some questions, definitely something worth having in your classroom or as table prompts. And again, when you get to that point where children start doing that by themselves, and they're the ones asking the questions, you know you've really got it. So that's questioning, really important. Encouraging mistakes, that safe space where you're trying out the obstacle course, if you like, is really important. It's a safe space for anybody to make mistakes and learn from them, to talk about any mistakes. It's quite good for you to make mistakes. I mean, accidentally probably sometimes, which is fine, but also deliberately. You know, oh, I'm going to solve this problem now. And it's about having that commentary all the time. Going to solve this problem now, but I'm feeling a bit tired today and I might make a mistake. So just watch me really carefully and make sure you tell me if I make a mistake. And then really pulling apart that mistake. Well, why have I made that mistake? What do you think my misconception is? really get the children to take part in that identification of misconceptions and thinking about where they came from as well. And that's where interventions can come in handy, because you can, if there's a misconception which you're noticing, you can then work with certain children if you need to try and plug that gap. So that is mistakes and misconceptions. I touched upon this a little bit earlier. Problem solving shouldn't be something that's just put at the end of the lesson. Yes, it is true that in order to be able to problem solve, there needs to be an element of fluency already embedded, but that doesn't follow that you should only do problem solving if you have grasped a concept fully. Sometimes problem solving can help alongside the fluency to help understanding, particularly if you're putting something into a real life context and it actually means something to the children and they can see why they might need to do it. It's very easy to focus on fluency in a lesson, and then when you finish, go on to the reasoning, and when you finish that, go on to the problem solving. It really needs to be all three hand in hand all the way through. And yes, you wouldn't start, you might start with a problem, you might use that as a hook, but everybody in your classroom needs to have the opportunity to solve problems, and definitely the opportunity to reason all the time. And that should just be an expectation. It's not a bolt on. Yes, for some children, if their fluency, if they've struggled with the fluency, you're going to have to think very carefully about what other tasks you give them. But problem solving isn't necessarily a harder version of fluency. It's just looking at something in a different way. So they definitely shouldn't be extensions or bolt-ons. And as I said, that discussion and talking about collaboration is a really good way of making sure that you're reasoning and problem solving all the time. And children aren't going to be able to just problem solve. That's a skill in its own right, and you will need to teach that. You will need to teach them how to problem solve, not just strategies for certain types of questions. They need to know how you problem solve. They need to see you do it. They need to have practice. Definitely needs to be taught. And yeah, we mentioned this at the very beginning. So automaticity is important, because you want the children to spend their brain space spotting patterns and explaining patterns and making problems and picking odd ones out. What you don't want them to be doing is spending all their time calculating things which should just come quite quickly. Things like times tables, but also number bonds, things like that actually come into maths all the time. And as the children go through the school, there's more and more things which you would like them to learn to automaticity. And certainly even to Key Stage 3, there are things that children are learning in Key Stage 3 and 4 that rely really, really heavily on things that we have taught the children in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. And if they really know them, they've got much more options of solving them, and solving them in different ways and mastering them, because they're not spending time thinking about things like number bonds and so on. And how you do that could look a bit different. I know that some schools program in a retrieval lesson 3 weeks after the teaching, and then 6 weeks after the teaching, just do a little quiz or something to do an assessment. That's possible. Or maybe you have a maths meeting or a daily maths event that you could use for retrieval of things that you've covered in the previous few weeks. But yeah, it's about keeping those skills going all the time, particularly those things that you want them to know, times tables being a key one, of course. Okay, so that was a lot in that session. We could have done a lot more, but before I take any questions, I just want you to have a little think about the things that we've talked about in today's session. Is there something, just a single thing, that you might take away and do tomorrow or in the next week or so? Try and think of something. You don't have to share it, but have a little think now about what you could do tomorrow. Just one thing you could do. Is there something that you would like to develop more in your practice? That might be out of your control. Maybe it's something you're going to go back and share with your SLT or your maths lead to talk about further about how you might do it in your setting. Or is there something you would like to find out a little bit more about? During today's session, there have been clips from a vast range of our resources at Twinkl, and on your reflections document you will get links to those. There's also a couple of links there to our social pages in primary maths, but it would be great if you could think of, even if it's just one tiny thing, maybe you'll think, okay, I'm going to print out those questions and I'm going to put them on my lanyard so I've got them. Or maybe you're thinking this, yeah, actually I'm going to go even further. If you're a maths lead, you might have the power to do that. So just have a little think about what you might do to change your practice. And although it seems a bit daunting, it's not a quick fix. If you very much don't teach for mastery at the moment, suddenly doing it isn't really an option. You're going to have to make lots of changes, and you're going to have to teach lots of things. For example, the art of collaboration, it's not an easy one, and will have to be taught as a separate thing. So thank you very much for listening to an awful lot of talk. You will of course get sent the slides as well, and there'll be time for questions. I think Helen will stop the recording first, and then we can have a bit of time for questions. Thank you again for listening. And yeah, it's great to see already Vicky's going to get that lanyard idea started. If you take one thing away from here today and use it tomorrow to help children's understanding, then that's great. So thank you very much for listening.